let's talk about the uh, recent political rhetoric towards China. Obviously, this dates back since really, what, the 1800s, all of this anti-China racism in America. But there's a specific kind of yellow peril, which you talk about in your piece, that I think has become bipartisan. You have, Trump using the China virus term, which was so obviously racist, to someone like Tim Ryan, who is running for Senate, casually talking about losing our jobs to China. It's so ubiquitous and widespread. So, what's your position on how that kind of rhetoric fuels, as you say, yellow peril in Washington and then throughout the country?
hmm And I think to understand what's happening today, it's also critical to look through history because in reality, you know, I think Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, Chinese Americans included, have always been basically pawns to be leveraged in the larger American pursuit of supremacy abroad. And so, whether it's Japanese internment during World War II, internment of Japanese American citizens, or the examples that I talked about in the article where American people, white Americans, beat up and killed Chinese Americans, mistaking them for Vietnamese people or Japanese Americans, et cetera, blaming them on losing jobs, on the deaths in the Vietnam War. There really isn't a desire to distinguish between a so-called foreign entity like the Chinese government and actually Chinese people here, right? Like that may be what elected officials say they're trying to do, but in reality, the way that the rhetoric comes out, and I would say is like really purposely like made to be hysteric, it still impacts people here. And so in recent years, especially with Trump's rhetoric, we've seen a rise in sort of anti-Asian violence. It's hard to say exactly what it's driven by, but when you look historically and see that whenever we've been at war and conflict somewhere in the Asia Pacific, and we've seen really purposeful hate crimes directed at people here, we think the parallel is pretty clear. And I would also say that the type of rhetoric that is shared really purposefully parallels the yellow peril rhetoric that we saw many years ago. So it's not just saying, oh, China has a really strong infrastructure plan. America needs a strong infrastructure plan. It's senators and generals saying we're in the most dangerous time of our we are in the most dangerous time ever, or saying that the Chinese government has really pernicious or subversive or malign influence. There's like this idea that China is always like, once given the opportunity, ready to take over the world, invade the US, take over the US, take over American jobs, American families, et cetera. When you look at what's actually happening in China, that doesn't really seem to be the case. And so
Yeah,
it's
so
like,
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just expand upon that because, you know, I was thinking today just about the Obama era and how there was all of this talk from Republican politicians about how, oh, we're so far in debt. Of course, they increased the debt under the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
China owns our debt and they're going to essentially foreclose on America, like this completely fanciful nonsense. But it's just the constant driving of a narrative that China's takeover is imminent. And inherent in a lot of these statements is this attempt to portray China as the military aggressor, which is just false compared to the United States. So just talk about how much the United States' military presence dwarfs that of China, even though if you ask the average American, I would imagine they think it's 1-to-1 or even like, oh, China's
Mm-hmm.
military, it's coming, it's around the corner, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the US spends somewhere north of $1 trillion on its military a year. I mean, it's hard to track because a lot of it is shadow spending. But the military budget, even like what is nominal or what's official, is more than the next 10 countries combined, right? Including China. The US has 800 military bases around the world. Depending on how you count China's bases, is between 1 to 3. So that's 800 times more. 400 or half of those bases are literally encircling China. So imagine if China, like the US is doing now, had bases off the coast of California, on the Atlantic coast, like in Mexico, in Canada, in the Bahamas, how the US would behave and who would be calling who an aggressor. The US has 20 times more nuclear warheads. The US refuses to commit to a no first use policy for nuclear weapons, which China actually does. And the US is spending $100 billion more on nuclear weapons over the next couple of years. And so when you lay out like each component of the military of each nation, it's really clear that one is posturing, right? And a lot of like what happens in these like national security conflicts is that there has to be a lot of posturing, because sometimes people want to project an attitude before they necessarily like go into conflict. And so like these are not just things we happen to be planning for. Posturing can also create accidents. The daily military exercises that the US is engaging in around China, having 100,000 plus troops stationed in the Asia Pacific. These are all acts of aggression and are designed to show China that we are ready to, or like have the power to invade or defeat, whenever you break a rule in the current sort of American order.
So, can you trace this back to Obama's pivot to Asia? We're kind of operating in a little bit more recent history, and I think where I want to focus, just because I think it's really a dynamic that most people are not aware of, especially if you're white or non-Asian. It's so bipartisan. And I think it's really going to be an important dynamic in the coming years and decades.
Yeah. So in 2011, 2012, Clinton and Obama announced their pivot to Asia policy. We were talking about drawing down from the forever wars, and looking sort of ahead to who the new enemy is, who might be competition in the world. They landed on Asia. And when you talk to people in the military, like it was really clear that's also when memos started circulating. People were beginning to practice island hopping in the Asia Pacific, or as the US military calls it, the Indo-Pacific, which is part of their rebrand, so that the United States doesn't seem like an outsider in the Asia Pacific. Like literally, people in American national security will say that we are an Indo-Pacific nation, which is, I don't think most Americans think of themselves as an Indo-Pacific nation. But
I doubt any American or most Americans even know that term or think of themselves in any way associated with that. But sorry, continue.
Yeah. And so a really purposeful change where about 60% of the naval and the naval and air forces were transferred to the Asia Pacific. At the same time, you saw rhetoric increasing about China. And part of this is the fact that historically, like when you look back on defense spending, it tends to increase when there's conflict. That's obvious. People want to pay for new weapons programs, whatever. But another way to get defense spending up is when there's a lot of talk about a new enemy, even if there's no direct hot war. So like in the Reagan era buildup of the 80s, there was a lot of talk, right? And so we're seeing that again today. Defense spending started to dip around 2012 as we were drawing down, and then looking around needed a new enemy to justify like an ever larger defense budget that is basically half of our discretionary federal budget today, even as Biden begs for money for his infrastructure plan. And so that new enemy really is China, and China is how you can get more money for all of the different weapons and other programs that you want.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.